in the corner, he would have been out the door. I'm sure of that. But anyway, where do you even start with a guy like Curt? I hope all of you are willing to stay until about 3 this morning because, if you have as many stories as most of us do about Curt, this could be a long time. But Curt was truly a pretty good friend. To coin Garrison Keillor's descriptors, he was pretty good. But to carry that a little further, Curt typified, I guess, the Norwegian bachelor farmer, another Garrison Keillorism. And Curt liked to be kidded about that. He sort of enjoyed that. And he fit the bill very well. Where could you find anybody that was as unpretentious, unassuming, humble as Curt was? So we have lost a pretty good friend. There's no doubt about that. I had the privilege of starting to work with Curt almost from the beginning when he arrived at the agency. And I think probably getting him installed up at Halsey, Nebraska, so he could work on his thesis was probably the first inkling of this guy is really interesting, because you move somebody into a town of a couple hundred people and they know more about you before you know anything about them. And so he was looked at with a lot of suspicion. I mean, this was the government moving into town, so to speak. He was a government guy. But once he rented the sheriff's house, everything was pretty smooth after that, because everybody knew the sheriff. Well, 2 months later, Curt probably knew as many people in that town as the sheriff did. And they always looked at Curt and said, what does this guy do? We know he watches birds, he chases birds, he's out in the field all the time. And I think they were as tickled with Curt being in Halsey as Curt was living there. Of all the places that Curt lived while he was in Nebraska, he probably enjoyed Halsey as much as any place I can think of. That was his place. I think he felt at home there, and there wasn't anybody that felt more at home than Curt did in the Sandhills. That was truly his place. And Joe Hyland and I were laughing about some of the exploits of Curt in the Sandhills. Let me tell you, Curt wasn't very mechanically inclined, and he didn't like driving, and he didn't like driving in the sand. So you can imagine the combination. Curt did a lot of digging, and I think Joe will attest to the fact that they probably spent a lot of time sitting calling antelope and everything else up there. I'm never sure whether they were really working or not. But at any rate, those were good times for Curt, definitely. Those times in the Sandhills. I spent a lot of time with Curt on road trips. Bill and Jan mentioned the road trip aspect. And we'd start out many times, when this first started, Curt got the assignments to do a lot of biological reconnaissance on lands that we were thinking about buying. And Curt would always really like somebody else to drive. And he'd sit there, but he'd always have everything ready. And we'd start out and he'd say, Lupus, go down Highway 92. And I'd say, but Curt, that's not on the way. He said, well, yeah, it is. It's pretty close. And I came to find out after a while, this was one of Curt's real secrets. He had more hole-in-the-wall restaurants and places that he knew about that had the biggest kolaches, the best sour cream raisin pie, the best strawberry rhubarb pie of any place in the state. And these were the places that we would sort of make this circuitous tour to make sure that we were there in time for coffee with pie or something else. So Bill and Jan were right. Mark was right. Curt really enjoyed eating, and he certainly enjoyed strong coffee, the sign of a good Norwegian bachelor farmer, obviously. So, Curt was one of those people, he would come out to the house and sort of stroll around and look. And my kids were in awe of Curt. they never quite knew how to take Curt, because he looked a little bit older, and I got to thinking, he really didn't look older, because I happened to look back when all of this was happening and look back at Curt's high school yearbook. Do that if you have the chance. He looks the same. He has that same look on his face in his high school yearbook as he did in that picture that was on the email that most of you got. It's that sort of cherub-looking face with that sort of twisted little grin that we all know Curt had, and it worked out. It worked out great. But at any rate, they mentioned Curt's love of Nora Salford's writings, and I seriously thought that when Norris gave up publishing, that Curt might take that over. I thought, wow, that would be a great place for Curt to live in Polk, Nebraska, take up the Polk Progress label, and just continue on with that. But I think Curt had other things in mind. But Curt had, he read everything. Pogo was one of those. Snoopy was another. And Curt derived a tremendous amount of knowledge from so many things. We always refer, Curt had the name of Max a lot of times. He'd go by that, but it was more Tweetus Americanus. That was sort of what, it was always Tweetus. You hardly called him Curt after a while, it was always Tweetus, what are you doing? But he had some other really bizarre interests in reading that we shared and laughed about. One was The Good Soldier Schweik. This was a satire on the military. And Curt delighted in reading that, and just, I think he sort of acted out some of those things. How long could you put off doing things before the administration caught on to what you were doing? This was a story of a guy who, in the First World War, never got to the front, but he was always trying. And Curt loved that. And I think it fit in with, sometimes Curt was a procrastinator. Some of you know that, who he had a great way of saying, yeah, I'm going to get around to doing that. Never knew what that ever meant. That was hilarious. But the other one that he liked and we talked about a lot was A Canticle for Leibowitz. Science fiction, one of the first science fiction novels. Curt really liked that. So his readings and interests were just varied all over the place. And I don't know what else to say other than we truly are going to miss a good friend for a long, long time. Most of you that depended on Curt for information, you're going to be lost. I know, who else could you call up and say, do you have the telephone number? Give me the telephone number for Whitney's or anybody, and Curt would rattle it off. He didn't have to look at a phone book. Curt didn't know what flash drives were or CDs. That was not in his vocabulary. But he could remember, as you well know, almost anything. And if he didn't, the stuff was on your desk the next morning. Which, this was another really great aspect of Curt. Curt did not put stuff down on tape or CD or anything. He had a unique system of vertical files. And his vertical files reached the point in a lot of places where, years of chronological data would tip over. And Curt could always find it, though. He was the only one that had the greatest knowledge and adaptations to find stuff in a vertical file of anybody I've ever known. One of the great adventures in life for many of us was to move Curt out of his apartment at Wesleyan and move him into Mike Grunwald's house. Well, there was a lot more room in the house, obviously, but let me tell you, moving Curt out, that could have taken eons because everything was piled vertically to the point where you really had to watch where you walked. But this was Curt. He was unique. And a lot of people said, well, he just isn't with this modern day living at all. And maybe he wasn't. But